The construction crew's jackhammer tore into Margaret Sullivan's North Meadow at 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The 52-year-old hydrologist stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips, watching heavy machinery carve a trench through wildflowers her late husband had planted 15 years ago. No notice, no permission. Just the HOA president's truck parked smugly at the edge of her property line, clipboard in hand, directing workers like he owned the place. 3 months of increasingly hostile HOA meetings had led to this. But what Richard Pemberton and his board didn't know was that Margaret had spent those 3 months studying exactly what they were building, and she just realized they'd made a catastrophic mistake. Before we get into how a water expert completely dismantled an HOA's illegal construction project, if you love stories where knowledge becomes the ultimate weapon, smash that like button and subscribe. Now let's watch this unfold. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that turned a scientist's grief into cold calculation, the confrontation where decades of expertise met entitled arrogance, and the resolution where water, the very thing they tried to steal, became their downfall. In the first part, you'll witness Margaret's journey from peaceful widow to tactical strategist. She'd moved to this 20-acre property seeking solitude after losing her husband, only to find herself trapped in an HOA nightmare. The meetings grew hostile. The demands became absurd. Then came the morning when construction equipment violated her land without permission, tearing through memories and ecosystems alike. What pushed her past anger into something colder was discovering exactly what they were building and recognizing the fatal flaw in their engineering. Her grief transformed into something sharper, professional curiosity mixed with righteous fury. The confrontation wasn't loud or emotional. It was surgical. Margaret let them finish their pipeline, document every violation, and celebrate their victory. Then she invited them to her property for a demonstration. What happened next involved property surveys, water rights documentation, and one very simple valve that controlled everything they'd built. The resolution came with the sound of pipes running dry and the sight of sprinkler systems sputtering to a stop across 6 HOA properties. Here's exactly how it happened. Margaret Rose Sullivan had earned her doctorate in hydrology from Stanford in 1998, spent 26 years consulting for municipalities on water management systems, and retired to her late husband David's family property in western Colorado, specifically to escape the complexity of human systems. The 20 acres of meadow, forest, and natural springs had been in the Sullivan family for 4 generations. David died of a heart attack 2 years ago, and Margaret sold their Denver home to live here permanently, seeking the kind of peace that only comes from land that remembers your loved ones. She was content with her vegetable garden, her twice-weekly video calls with her daughter in Seattle, and the natural spring that bubbled up from limestone bedrock on the eastern edge of her property, feeding a creek that wound through the meadow before continuing downslope. The trouble started 6 months after she moved in full time. The Pine Ridge HOA, which governed the 12 luxury homes built on former Sullivan land that David's brother had sold off in 2009, began attending her property with increasingly aggressive demands. They wanted her to maintain her fence line to their standards. They wanted her to control the deer that wandered from her property to theirs. They wanted her to agree to road maintenance fees for a road she never used. Margaret attended every meeting, politely declined their overreach, and cited property law with the precision of someone who'd read every relevant statute. This infuriated HOA President Richard Pemberton, a 58-year-old real estate investor who'd made millions flipping properties and believed money bought compliance. The first real incident came in late April when Margaret discovered HOA contractors clearing brush along her eastern property line without permission. She called the sheriff, who told Pemberton to stop, but no citations were issued. 3 weeks later, she found survey stakes driven into her meadow 50 feet inside her fence line. She pulled them up and returned them to Pemberton's mailbox with a copy of her property deed. The third incident was the breaking point. She came home from grocery shopping to find Pemberton himself walking her land with a surveyor, pointing at her natural spring, discussing flow rates and easements like she didn't exist. Margaret confronted them immediately, her voice steady but her hands shaking with rage. "This is private property. Leave now or I'm calling the sheriff again." Pemberton had smiled, that practiced, condescending smile of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Mrs. Sullivan, we're simply exploring options for community water access. This spring serves no purpose just sitting here. Our engineering study shows it could support irrigation for the entire HOA. We're prepared to offer you reasonable compensation." She'd stared at him, this man who thought her husband's legacy was negotiable, and said quietly, "Get off my land." His smile disappeared. "You're being unreasonable. We'll be back to discuss this with proper legal counsel." But they didn't come back to discuss. They came back with construction equipment. Margaret called the sheriff that Tuesday morning, but by the time Deputy Morrison arrived, Pemberton had produced an emergency easement permit, signed by a county commissioner Margaret later discovered was Pemberton's poker buddy, claiming urgent need to access community water resources. The deputy shrugged helplessly. Margaret stood in her driveway and watched them work for 3 hours. Then she went inside, opened her laptop, and began documenting everything with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting an experiment. If they wanted to play games with water systems, she would show them what happened when you challenged someone who understood water better than they understood their own arrogance. The pipeline took them 11 days to complete. Margaret watched every hour of construction through binoculars, photographed every connection point, and tracked every vehicle that entered her property. She said nothing, made no calls, filed no complaints. The HOA workers began to relax, joking loudly about the crazy widow who'd finally learned her place. On day 8, she walked the pipeline route herself after the crew left, GPS unit in hand, mapping every section. On day 9, she visited the county records office and pulled the original water rights documentation for her property, filed in 1947, when David's grandfather first developed the spring. On day 10, she hired a property lawyer named James Chen who specialized in water rights disputes and smiled when she explained the situation. Day 12 was the completion celebration. Pemberton and 5 HOA board members stood in Margaret's meadow beside their new pipeline junction point, admiring the stainless steel connections that would feed their irrigation systems. That's when Margaret walked out to meet them, carrying a leather folder and wearing the same calm expression she'd worn in countless municipal meetings when explaining to city councils why their plans violated hydrological principles. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying across the meadow, "I'd like to show you something." Pemberton's expression flickered between annoyance and uncertainty. "Mrs. Sullivan, the construction is complete. We'll be removing our equipment tomorrow. You'll receive your easement compensation within 30 days. Margaret smiled. "I don't want your compensation, Richard. I want you to understand what you've built." She opened her folder. "Let's start with names, since we're all going to know each other very well over the next few months. Richard Pemberton, 58, President. Donald Chen, 61, Vice President and owner of 447 Pine Ridge Drive. Susan Martinez, 54, Treasurer and owner of 392 Pine Ridge Drive. Paul Hendricks, 49, owns 523 Pine Ridge. Jennifer Wu, 46, owns 448 Pine Ridge. Thomas Ashford, 67, owns 501 Pine Ridge." The board members exchanged glances. Margaret continued, pulling out a surveyor's map. "This pipeline you've built runs 847 feet across my property, connecting to the natural spring located here." She pointed to a red circle on the map. "The spring that, according to water rights documentation filed in 1947 and updated in 1983, belongs exclusively to the Sullivan family with senior rights priority under Colorado water law. The spring that you have now illegally tapped without permission, permit, or legal authority." Donald Chen stepped forward. "We have an emergency easement." Margaret cut him off with a laugh that held no humor. "You have a fraudulent document signed by Commissioner Williams who lacks authority to grant water rights access under state law. Water rights in Colorado don't work like property easements, Donald. They're separate, regulated by the Division of Water Resources. I spent 26 years of my career navigating these exact statutes." She pulled out another document. "I filed a formal complaint with the state engineer's office 4 days ago. They'll be here next week to inspect your illegal diversion." Pemberton's face had gone pale. You let us finish construction. I let you document your own violation, Margaret said calmly. Every pipe section, every connection, every gallon of water you plan to steal. Now let me explain your options. She walked to the junction point where their pipeline connected to her spring's outflow. There, partially concealed by native grasses, was a valve wheel painted green to blend with the surroundings. This is the source valve. The water feeding your entire pipeline flows through here first. Option 1. You pay for complete pipeline removal within 14 days, restore my meadow to its original condition, and pay for environmental impact assessment and restoration. Cost estimate, $47,000. Timeline, immediately. Option 2. I close this valve right now, your 6 homes lose their irrigation water, and we let state water authorities determine penalties for illegal diversion. Those penalties start at $500 per day per violation and can include criminal charges. Susan Martinez found her voice. You can't just turn off water. I absolutely can, Margaret said. It's my water flowing from my spring across my land. You built a pipeline to steal it. Watch me. She reached for the valve wheel. Pemberton's hand shot out. Wait, we can discuss this reasonably. Margaret's expression hardened. Like you discussed it reasonably when you drove construction equipment through my meadow, when you destroyed my husband's wildflowers, when you surveyed my land without permission 3 separate times, when you smiled at me like I was an obstacle instead of a property owner. Her hand stayed on the valve. You have 60 seconds to accept option 1, or I close this valve and call the state engineer myself. The board members argued among themselves in frantic whispers. Paul Hendricks tried negotiating. We can pay for the restoration, but $47,000 is excessive. Margaret turned the valve 1/4 turn. The change was immediate. From somewhere downslope came the sound of water pressure dropping, pipes shuddering. 45 seconds, she said. Jennifer Wu grabbed Pemberton's arm. Richard, just agree. My lawn irrigation starts tomorrow. I have $30,000 of landscaping. 30 seconds, Margaret said, turning the valve another 1/4 turn. The pipes groaned louder. Pemberton broke. Fine, we'll pay for removal and restoration. Turn the water back on. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then slowly reopened the valve. Water pressure normalized. You have 14 days. Every day past that, I add $1,000 to the cost. Now get off my property. They left in 3 separate vehicles, no one speaking. The next morning, Margaret's lawyer James Chen sent formal demand letters to all 6 board members, itemizing costs and including photographic evidence of every trespass, every violation, and the fraudulent easement document. He also filed ethics complaints against Commissioner Williams. Within 48 hours, Pemberton called requesting a meeting. They met in Chen's office with all 6 board members present. The arrogance was gone. Pemberton looked like he'd aged 5 years in 2 days. We've secured funding for the removal, he said quietly. We want to avoid state involvement. Margaret nodded. Here's what's going to happen. You'll hire an environmental restoration company I approve. They'll remove every inch of pipeline, test soil contamination, and restore native vegetation. You'll pay for wildlife habitat assessment since you destroyed Meadow ecosystem. Total revised cost, $52,000. You'll also sign a permanent easement agreement stating the HOA has no claim, current or future, to any water sources on my property. Thomas Ashford, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. The HOA treasury doesn't have that kind of money. We'll have to assess each homeowner. That's not my problem, Margaret said. You authorized this illegal construction. You deal with your members. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks into the removal process, Margaret discovered that Pemberton had secretly been recording their conversations trying to build a harassment case against her. She found out because his own board turned on him. Susan Martinez, the treasurer, brought Margaret the recordings along with financial documents showing Pemberton had been embezzling HOA funds for 3 years, using the pipeline project to cover missing money. Martinez was furious about the special assessment and wanted Pemberton gone. Margaret gave the financial evidence to her lawyer, who gave it to the district attorney. Pemberton resigned from the HOA board and faced embezzlement charges. The special assessment hit all 12 HOA properties anyway, $4, $300 each to cover pipeline removal, restoration, and legal fees. 3 families sold their homes rather than pay. Property values in Pine Ridge HOA dropped 8% when the news spread through local real estate channels. Margaret stood in her meadow 8 weeks after the Valve confrontation, watching the restoration company plant native wildflower seeds where the pipeline trench had scarred the earth. The spring burbled peacefully in the morning sun, feeding the creek exactly as it had for 100 years. Her daughter Sarah had flown in from Seattle for a long weekend, and they walked the property together, talking about David, about justice, about the difference between revenge and boundaries. Margaret had learned something her husband used to say: water always finds the path of least resistance, but that doesn't mean it's weak. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply control the source. And as she watched the creek flow through her restored meadow, past the boundary where entitled neighbors had learned a $52,000 lesson, she smiled. Because justice, whether it flows hot or runs cold, always finds its level eventually. Across the country in Savannah, Georgia, retired civil engineer Patricia Monroe was reviewing her mail when she found an HOA citation for her unapproved garden shed. Patricia looked at the structure her late father had built in 1967, 30 years before the HOA existed, and pulled out the original neighborhood planning documents she'd helped draft as a city engineer. The HOA president had just cited a woman who literally designed the streets he drove on. But that's a story for another time.